Hello, my name is David Marlar, and welcome to this mini lecture on 19th and 20th century Britain for the course Culture and Literature 2, British Culture and Literature at Rotterdam University of Applied Sciences. The goal of this mini seminar is that you'll be able to explain the major developments of the 19th, 20th, and some of the 21st centuries, and that you can describe the importance of certain key historical events such as Victorian England, the Industrial Revolution, political reforms, World War I, World War II, and post-war UK. In this specific mini-lecture, we will be covering the Industrial Revolution, Victorian Britain, 20th century extremism, the British Empire, the Battle of Britain, and post-war Britain. We're going to begin with 19th century Britain. Not long after this century began, Britain had lost its most important colonies, the North American ones that later became the United States, in the War of Independence. But during this time, in the early 19th century, British colonizers had begun massive immigration towards places like Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. We can look at the 19th century as being a time of Britain building up its empire. And in the 19th century, we can definitely see Britain as one of the world's, if not the world's, most wealthy country. But not everything went as planned. At the same time, a potato famine ravaged one part of the British Empire, Ireland. This, of course, caused the massive loss of Irish culture and language because large portions of the population either died or emigrated to the United States. Sometimes even they immigrated to England. This made Ireland more British, but it also caused anger in many of the island's Catholic population. This is due to the fact that aid was given to people through the church, and primarily the Anglican Church. The famine, coupled with land reforms from previous centuries, left the Catholic population impoverished and susceptible to death and starvation. This later became a problem for the United Kingdom, because there was a large amount of resentment from the Catholic population that eventually led to the Irish War of Independence in the early 20th century. Another of Britain's colonies was India, an enormous country with culture more ancient than Britain's. Tens of thousands of British civil servants and troops were used to government. This government was called the Raj, and at the head of the administration was a viceroy, or a type of governor, whose position within the country was similar to that of a monarch. Because Britain was so far away and the journey took so long, these British officials spent most of their lives in India, and they developed a distinct way of life. But they still considered themselves to be British, and imposed British institutions, ideas, cultures, and methods of government on the Indian people. Large parts of Africa also belonged to the empire. Many of these were used not necessarily for British settlement, but they were used for trade. An exception of this is especially South Africa, where large portions of British people did colonize and still live there today. The growth of the empire was encouraged by a change in attitude during the century. Previously, colonization had been a matter of settlement, commerce, and sometimes even military strategy. But in the 19th century, colonization was seen more as a matter of destiny, as the book calls it. And this can be linked to the idea of the white man's burden. According to many in Britain, the country had a goal to civilize the world. The idea was that British were ethnically superior to other people and had a responsibility to conquer and educate them. During the century, Britain became the world's foremost economic power. This was primarily due to the stability that did not exist in other parts of Europe. If we look at France, for instance, with Napoleon, the British were able to keep a relatively stable political and government climate, and this gave the British a sense of arrogance about their culture and civilization. It made them feel that they were superior to even other European countries, and it made them feel morally able to deal with the rest of the world. We can see this in Richard Kipling's White Man's Burden, which was actually a poem written for the United States to encourage the Americans to also start to colonize parts of Asia that they had won from Spain. Now, the first question that you're going to be doing, that you have to have prepared for the online seminar, is a question about Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria changed the way that the British people looked at their monarch and how the monarch should behave in her function in society. What way of looking at the monarch changed during Victoria's reign? You need to look in your textbook and find the answer, and make sure that you bring it with you. The 19th century in Britain was also caused a large change, I should say, in the British social fabric. People moved massively from the countryside to the cities and towns to work mainly in factories. This is embodied in many Victorian literary works like Dickens's Great Expectations, or Bleak House, or even Oliver Twist. The Industrial Revolution had a large effect on British values. Aspects like hard work, thrift, religious observance, the family, and awareness of one's duty in public life, and extreme respectability and almost rigidity in sexual matters became the main values of the times. This had a massive impact on Britain today. These values are still very common in contemporary British society. And it's also important to note that a lot of these Victorian values were actually exported to many of Britain's colonies. So we can see that a change in the ideas of sexual morality that are really prevalent today, that we even consider to be stereotypical of some developing countries like India and countries in Africa, were actually import products from British colonialism. In the 19th century, we see that many political reforms happened in Britain. It's important to note that the way that political reforms happened in Britain was by a type of design where they should not happen all at one time. Political reforms were seen as needing to be very gradual. So we see several political reforms, such as the abolishment of slavery, human rights are starting to be recognized, religious persecution was gradually ended, and laws to protect workers were introduced. But despite all these reforms, many people were forced to live and work in deplorable conditions. This was one of the reasons why the 20th century in Britain began with a period of extremism. Many people wanted to revolt against the monarchy and the capitalistic system of governments. Cramped cities and towns also led people to have a kind of sentimental view about the countryside. This is something that you can see in a lot of literature. The second question that you're going to answer for the lecture is about the age of extremism. The beginning of the 20th century was known as a time of extremism. Describe why it was considered extremist, who the various so-called extremist groups were, and what they were fighting for. You can find this information in your textbook, and you have to make sure that you have it with you for the online seminar. In the beginning of the 20th century, we start to see the decline of the British Empire. In 1919, the British Empire reached its largest point with territories gained from the mainly defeated Ottoman Empire, such as British Palestine. These territories were often called mandates. So the British mandate for Palestine, of course, was the part of the Middle East that Britain had acquired through the Treaty of Versailles. Even at the Treaty of Versailles, many of the so-called colonies like Canada and Australia represented themselves. So we see that Britain's empire at the beginning of the 20th century starts to resemble more of a confederation of various countries than as a closely knit top-down organization. The large dismantlement of the British Empire began after World War II, when India was split up into two and later three countries, namely Pakistan and India, and then later East Pakistan became Bangladesh. In 1956, British and French military action to stop the Egyptian government taking over the Suez Canal failed because it didn't receive any American support. This primarily has to deal with a way that the American government at the time looked at colonialization. It's also one of the reasons why, for instance, the Indonesian people that are from the Molucca minority were never able to get the country that they were allowed to. The United States wanted a total end to colonization from Europe. In Egypt, this was called the Suez Canal Crisis, this failed attempt by the French and the English to take control of the Suez Canal. We also see this later, this failure of Britain to be able to control its old colonies, when Turkey invades Cyprus. Britain was not even consulted when dealing with its old colony. In 1997, we see one of the last British colonies, Hong Kong, being turned over to China. If you look online, you can see that a lot of places in Asia were at one time part of the British Empire, such as Singapore, India, Pakistan, etc. Now, World War II was different for Britain than it was for a lot of other countries. This is because Britain was one of the few countries in Europe that the Germans never successfully invaded. Other nations that took the brunt of the war, like Russia, were invaded but were eventually successful and able to defeat Germany. The Battle of Britain was a military campaign of the Second World War in which the Royal Air Force, or the RAF, defended the UK against large-scale attacks by Nazi Germany's Air Force, which is called the Luftwaffe. The Battle of Britain was Britain's response to the Blitz, which was a large-scale attack against the British people by the Luftwaffe. In the Blitz, about 40 to 43,000 British civilians were killed, and around 100,000 people were injured, and thousands upon thousands of buildings in cities like London were totally destroyed. The most important person in the Second World War and in British history is, of course, Winston Churchill. He's one of Britain's most memorable prime ministers, and he is known as primarily as a wartime prime minister and is seen as one of the leading figures and leaders of the Allied forces alongside Stalin and Roosevelt. The speech above is Churchill's most famous. In his famous Finest Hour speech, he said that we shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. Churchill believed that Hitler and the evils of Nazism had to be abolished no matter what the cost. He knew that the RAF was Britain's main defense against German troops crossing the English Channel, so he ensured that the RAF, the Royal Air Force, stayed strong. He did this by using a lot of pilots that came from outside of Britain. The British were able to eventually defeat the Germans on the Western Front, but it came at a large toll to the British people. Around 886,000 soldiers and 70,000 civilians were killed. And this amounts to about 2% of the British population during the war. Now, it's important to remember that the Battle of Britain really only refers to the first, we could say the first year to 2 years of the war, when there was a Luftwaffe assault. But the entire Second World War was primarily fought by Britain, and they had the help of many of their colonies and ex-colonies. After the war, Britain began to change drastically. Decolonization, as was mentioned earlier, had already begun. And it was also the start of the 20th century that the urban working class finally began to make its voice heard. In Parliament, the Labour Party began to lose power. It's not necessarily the Labour Party, but it's the people who backed the Labour Party. The working class for a long time had been the backbone of British political life, and they yielded large amounts of power because many people worked in manufacturing. But as the urban working class began to grow, so did political life in England begin to change, and we see parties like the Liberals starting to take much more control over the way that the leftist parties look. So a lot of the ideas that we see about liberalism, which is used differently in English than it is in many other European countries, as being more progressive, really start to become key and take hold of the British left. British culture also started becoming one of its most influential export products. For instance, here we see the Beatles, which were an English rock band formed in Liverpool in the 1960s, with a lineup comprising mainly of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr. As of today, they are regarded as one of the most influential bands of all time. Post-war England also saw England entering the European community. The UK first made its application to join the European Union, or at the time the European Community, in 1961, and it was immediately apparent that this was not going to happen. At the time, the UK had feared isolation from within Western Europe, and they feared that Commonwealth states such as Canada, Australia, but also many places like India and in Africa were rushing to do deals with the new European Union, and it had American support. The application to become part of the European Union was vetoed by the French government twice, first in 1963 and for a second time in 1967. And it wasn't until the 1970s that the Brits were even allowed to join the European Union. Some historians have hinted that this may be one reason for the recent Brexit. For a long time, the British were seen as a threat in Europe, and they were also treated differently than other countries. The UK eventually joined the European Economic Community, as it was then called, on the 1st of January in 1973 with Denmark and Ireland. As the UK in a Changing Europe Foundation said, the British disliked many of the supernatural and technocratic elements in the treaties. They were worried about damaging links with the Commonwealth, and they wished to pursue a one world economic system policy in which sterling was the central currency. This is one of the main reasons why the UK never joined the European Coal Steel Community and the European Economic Community at the beginning, which meant that when they did eventually join in 1973, they had to accept many elements that had proved controversial with British voters. For instance, supranationalism, common agricultural policy, and a very expensive budget. This proved to be one of the biggest problems for the British people in eventually accepting the European Union, and of course has been some of the major reasons cited by people from the Brexit camp for the reason why they left. Now, the last question that you have on 19th and 20th century British history is going to be about civil unrest. Britain is unusual among European countries in that, for more than 300 years, there has been not a single revolution or civil war. What I'd like you to think about, to bring with you to the online seminar, is why you think this is. This is the end of the web lecture, and make sure that you bring all of your answers to the questions to the seminar. We'll see you there. Bye-bye.